The Ural Mountains are among the oldest on Earth, a weathered spine of rock and permafrost that divides Europe from Asia. In the winter of 1959, this range was a labyrinth of blinding white and silence, a place where the wind doesn't just blow, it screams. On the morning of February 26th, a search party crested a ridge on the slopes of a peak the local Mansi people called Kholat Syakh, the Mountain of the Dead. There, they found a single tattered tent, half buried in the snow and eerily silent. The tent was slashed open from the inside, its canvas fluttering like a broken wing. Most of the hikers' belongings, their boots, their heavy coats, their precious maps, were still neatly arranged within. But of the 9 hikers who had sought shelter there was no sign. It was as if they had simply evaporated into the thin, freezing air. What the searchers would discover over the coming weeks would spark one of the most enduring mysteries of the 20th century. It is a story of youthful ambition met with a brutal, inexplicable end. It is a narrative reconstructed from frozen diaries and grainy 35mm film, yet it is a narrative that remains fundamentally broken. Even today, despite decades of investigation and the weight of modern science, the question remains: why did 9 experienced hikers flee their only source of survival in the middle of a sub-zero night, only to meet their deaths in the snow? To understand the tragedy, we must first understand the people. These were not amateurs. The group, led by 2 3-year-old Igor Dyatlov, consisted of students and graduates of the Ural Polytechnic Institute. They were some of the brightest minds of their generation, sturdy and disciplined, products of a Soviet era that prized physical endurance and scientific rigor. They were aiming for a Category 3 certification, the highest level of difficulty available at the time. To earn it, they had to cover over 300 kilometers of the northern Ural wilderness. Archival photographs recovered from their cameras show a group full of life. You see them on the train, laughing, playing instruments, and sharing meals. There is Zinaida Kolmogorova, a charismatic 22-year-old, Lyudmila Dubinina, a tough-minded athlete, and Semyon Zolotaryov, the oldest at 37, a mysterious war veteran who had joined the group at the last minute. The images capture a sense of profound camaraderie. They were friends, bound by a shared love for the harsh beauty of the Russian winter. But as they moved deeper into the wilderness, the landscape began to push back. On January 28th, one member of the group, Yuri Yudin, was forced to turn back due to a sudden onset of debilitating joint pain. In a grainy photograph, he is seen embracing Lyudmila Dubinina. It was a goodbye he thought was temporary. He watched his 9 friends trek into the white haze, becoming small specks against the horizon until they vanished. Yuri Yudin would be the only one to survive. But as he walked away, he had no way of knowing that the group was already moving toward a series of decisions that historians still struggle to justify. By January 31st, the group reached the edge of the highland area and began preparing for the final ascent. Records suggest they built a labaz, a storage cache for extra food and equipment they wouldn't need for the summit to lighten their loads. On February 1st, they began moving through the pass that would later bear Dyatlov's name. The weather was deteriorating. Visibility dropped. Instead of moving over the pass and down into the safety of the tree line on the other side, the group made a curious choice. They steered slightly west and pitched their tent directly on the exposed, windswept slope of Kholat Syakh. Some historians believe they were simply trying to avoid losing the altitude they had gained. Others suggest Dyatlov wanted to practice camping on an incline, a common tactic for high-altitude mountaineering. Their final diary entries show no signs of distress. They ate a late dinner of Lotsio sliced lard and settled into their sleeping bags. The last photograph taken by the group shows them digging into the snow to level the ground for the tent. They look tired, but focused. The night was quiet, but it was a quiet that preceded a total collapse of order. At some point between midnight and 3 a.m., something happened inside that tent. Something so sudden and so terrifying that 9 people experienced, disciplined, and survival-trained felt they had no choice but to cut their way out of their shelter and run into the darkness of a 30-degree Celsius night. And that's when things began to shift from a standard mountain accident into something far more disturbing. When the search party reached the tent weeks later, they were struck by the tracks. Leading away from the slashed canvas were sets of footprints. Some were made by boots, but most were made by socks, and some were made by bare feet. The tracks were orderly at first, moving down the slope toward the tree line nearly a mile away. There was no sign of a struggle, no sign of an intruder, and most importantly, no sign of panic. They weren't running, they were walking. But why would anyone walk away from their life-saving equipment and their stocking feet? The searchers followed the tracks down toward a large cedar tree at the edge of the forest. Beneath its branches, they found the first evidence of the tragedy's scale. There lay the bodies of Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonishchenko. They were dressed only in their undergarments. Their hands were burned, and nearby were the charred remains of a small fire. Most unsettlingly, branches of the cedar tree were broken up to 5 meters high, as if one of them had tried to climb the tree to see something back toward the tent, or perhaps to flee from something on the ground. The searchers looked further. Between the cedar and the tent, they found 3 more bodies. Igor Dyatlov, Zinaida Kolmogorova, and Rustam Slobodin. They were positioned in a line, facing toward the tent. It appeared they had been trying to crawl back to their shelter, one by one, before the cold finally claimed them. At this point, the Soviet authorities believed this was a straightforward case of hypothermia, a tragic accident, likely caused by a sudden storm or a small avalanche. The bodies showed no major external trauma. But that wasn't the strangest part. As the spring thaw began in May, the search party turned their attention to a ravine about 75 meters away from the cedar tree. Beneath 4 meters of packed snow, they found the remaining 4 hikers: Dubinina, Zolotaryov, Kolevatov, and Thibault Brignol. Unlike the others, these 4 were better dressed, having apparently scavenged clothing from their deceased companions at the tree. But when the medical examiner performed the autopsies on these final 4, the narrative of a simple weather-related tragedy fractured entirely. These hikers hadn't died quietly from the cold. Nikolai Thibault Brignol's had a massive skull fracture. Ludmila Dubinina and Semyon Zolotaryov had extensive chest fractures, their ribs crushed with a force that doctors compared to the impact of a high-speed car crash. Yet, there was a glaring contradiction. Despite the internal devastation, the shattered bone and internal bleeding, there were no corresponding bruises or soft tissue damage on the outside of their bodies. It was as if they had been crushed by a massive pressure that left the skin untouched. What they found next changed the narrative entirely. The medical examiner, Boris Vozrojdeny, noted that the force required to cause such internal damage was immense, equivalent to a sudden, high-pressure blast or a collision. Yet, the lack of external trauma remained a baffling paradox. As the examination of Ludmila Dubinina continued, a more macabre detail emerged. She was missing her tongue, her eyes, and part of her facial tissue. While some modern forensic experts suggest this could be the result of natural decomposition or small scavengers in the running water of the ravine, at the time, it added a layer of visceral horror to an already incomprehensible scene. But the trauma wasn't the only thing that defied easy explanation. When investigators tested the clothing of the hikers found in the ravine, they discovered something that didn't belong in the wilderness of the Urals. Several pieces of clothing, specifically those belonging to Kolevatov and Krivonischenko, showed elevated levels of radioactive contamination. In the height of the Cold War, the presence of radiation immediately cast a shadow of state involvement over the tragedy. Some historians believe this contamination could be traced back to the hikers' previous work in laboratories or factories. Krivonischenko, for instance, had been involved in the cleanup of the Mayak nuclear disaster 2 years prior. However, the presence of these particles on a remote mountainside fueled decades of speculation about secret weapons testing or fallen rocket components. This lead would eventually point toward a world of state secrets, but the investigation was reaching a dead end. In May 1959, the official case was closed. The Soviet authorities concluded that the hikers had died as a result of an unknown compelling force. It was a vague, frustratingly non-committal phrase that served to end the legal inquiry while leaving the families with no real answers. The files were sent to a secret archive, and the pass was closed to hikers for several years. But for those who studied the case files, one detail in the testimony of other hikers in the region stood out. On the night of the tragedy, another group of trekkers about 50 kilometers away reported seeing strange orange spheres floating in the night sky toward Kholat-Syakh. These sightings were corroborated by members of the local military and meteorological departments. For years, these orbs were the centerpiece of various theories ranging from the extraterrestrial to the experimental. Yet, as investigators looked closer at the physical evidence, they had to confront the most pressing question: what could possibly force 9 people to cut their way out of a tent and march to their deaths? The most persistent theory, and the one favored by modern investigators, is an avalanche. It is a logical, grounded explanation. A slab avalanche, a thick layer of snow sliding as a single block, could have been triggered by the hikers themselves when they cut into the slope to pitch their tent. If a slab of snow had crashed down on them while they slept, it would explain the heavy internal injuries found in the ravine victims. It would explain the panic, the need to cut the tent open to escape being buried alive, and the decision to move toward the tree line to find shelter. However, the physical evidence at the campsite told a very different story. When the searchers arrived, the tent was still partially standing. The ski poles used as supports were still in place. There was no massive debris field, no evidence of a slide that had swept the area. Furthermore, the footprints leading away from the tent were not those of people fleeing a crashing wall of snow. They were rhythmic and purposeful. If it wasn't a wall of snow, perhaps it was something less visible. Some researchers have proposed the theory of infrasound. This phenomenon occurs when wind blows over a specific topography, like the shape of Kholat-Syakh, creating a low-frequency hum that is inaudible to the human ear, but capable of inducing intense feelings of dread, nausea, and psychological panic. Records suggest the wind that night was exceptionally fierce. Is it possible that a Kármán vortex street formed, creating a sonic environment so unbearable that the hikers were driven into a temporary state of madness? It is a compelling idea, but it remains speculative. What we do know is that once they reached the cedar tree, the group's cohesion began to shatter under the weight of the cold. The fire they built was small, struggling against the wind. The broken branches of the tree suggest they were desperately trying to keep an eye on their tent, perhaps waiting for a threat to pass or looking for a signal from the others. The Mansi theory was also briefly considered by the initial investigators. The Kholat-Syakh region was ancestral hunting ground for the indigenous Mansi people. Early reports questioned whether the hikers had inadvertently desecrated a holy site and been attacked, but this was quickly discounted. The Mansi were known for their peaceful relationship with travelers, and there were no signs of other human tracks in the deep snow surrounding the camp. The injuries, too, did not match those of a physical assault by hunters. There were no knife wounds, no bullet holes, and no evidence of a struggle with another person. And that's when the timeline of the survivors becomes even more tragic. After the 2 jurists died at the cedar tree, it appears the remaining survivors made a desperate, bifurcated attempt to live. Dyatlov, Kolmogorova, and Slobodin tried to make it back to the tent to retrieve their supplies. One can only imagine the sheer willpower required to crawl through waist-deep snow in temperatures that freeze skin in minutes. One by one, they collapsed. Zinaida Kolmogorova was found the furthest from the tree, her face buried in the snow, her frozen hands seemingly reaching out toward the ridge. The final four, meanwhile, moved into the ravine, likely seeking shelter from the wind. They were better equipped, wearing pieces of clothing taken from their fallen friends, a grim but necessary act of survival. But the ravine was not a sanctuary. It became a tomb. The mystery of their injuries, the crushed ribs and fractured skulls, remains the focal point of every modern re-examination. If it wasn't an avalanche, could it have been something related to the military? Some researchers have pointed to the fact that the hiker's skin was described as having an unusual orange tan at their funerals. While this is often a natural byproduct of mummification and sun exposure on snow, it added to the persistent belief that they were exposed to something chemical or atmospheric. In the late 1950s, the Soviet Union was testing various R-7 missiles. Some have suggested that a failed launch or a jettisoned fuel tank could have released a cloud of toxic propellant or created a pressure wave that struck the camp. This would explain the orange spheres and the internal injuries without external bruising. But there is no clear consensus, and the Russian government has never released documents confirming a missile test in that specific area on that specific night. What emerged next was a piece of evidence that had been overlooked for decades, buried in the margins of a hiker's diary. Among the personal belongings recovered from the campsite was a camera belonging to Semyon Zolotaryov. As the oldest member of the group and a veteran of the Great Patriotic War, Zolotaryov was an enigma to the others. He had joined the expedition at the 11th hour, and some of the students initially found him distant. When his body was recovered from the ravine, investigators were surprised to find he had died with a pen in one hand and a notepad in the other, as if he had been trying to record a final message that the cold simply wouldn't let him finish. But it was the film inside his camera that provided the most haunting artifact of the investigation. The final frame, frame 33, is a blurry, distorted image of a bright light against a dark background. Enthusiasts of the mystery have long argued it depicts one of the orange spheres reported by witnesses. Skeptics, however, point out it could easily be a light leak or an accidental exposure as the camera was being handled in the chaos. Regardless of its origin, the image has become a symbol of the Dyatlov Pass, a glimpse into a reality that is just out of focus. As the years turned into decades, the Soviet Union collapsed, and the secret files were gradually declassified. In the 1990s and 2000s, a new generation of investigators revisited the evidence. They found that the original 1959 investigation had been conducted with surprising haste. Crucial evidence had been handled poorly, and the unknown compelling force conclusion was seen by many as a convenient way for the state to avoid a complicated technical or military explanation. Yet, despite the reopening of the case by the Russian Prosecutor General's office in 2019, the mystery refused to be solved by a single, clean answer. The 2019 inquiry focused strictly on natural causes: avalanche, slab slide, or hurricane, dismissing any possibility of a criminal or military nature. They concluded that a slab avalanche was the most likely culprit. They argued that the hikers, fearing a second slide, moved away from the tent toward the ridge, only to be caught in the open by a drop in temperature and visibility. But for the families of the victims, this answer felt hollow. It didn't fully explain the radioactive clothing, the missing facial tissue, or the sheer force required to break ribs without bruising the skin. It also didn't explain why the tent was still visible and not buried when searchers arrived. In 2021, a new layer of evidence emerged from an unlikely source. Two Swiss researchers, Johann Gaume and Alexander Puzrin, published a study in the journal Nature that utilized advanced computer modeling, the same technology used to simulate snow physics in Hollywood films like Frozen. Their model suggested that a delayed slab avalanche was physically possible on Kholat Syakh. Their theory proposed that the hikers' decision to cut a ledge into the slope for their tent, combined with hours of wind-deposited snow building up above them, created a ticking time bomb. The slab didn't slide immediately. It waited for hours until a specific gust of wind or a thermal shift triggered a collapse. The heavy, compacted block of snow would have struck the hikers with the force of a falling car while they were still in their sleeping bags. This model finally provided a scientifically grounded explanation for the internal injuries. It explained why they had to cut the tent to get out. The entrance was likely pinned under a heavy block of snow. It explained why they left without boots. The trauma of the impact and the fear of an immediate follow-up slide made every second outside the tent feel safer than a second inside. Yet, even this sophisticated model has its detractors. Some veteran hikers who have visited the pass argue that the slope is not steep enough to support such an avalanche, and that the slab theory still doesn't account for the chaotic distribution of the bodies or the strange lights seen in the sky. And that's when the narrative returns to the human element, the part of the story that science cannot model. Records suggest that the group did not simply die in a blind panic. There is evidence of a desperate, coordinated struggle for survival. They shed clothes, they built a fire, they attempted to return for their supplies. They didn't give up. The tragedy of the Dyatlov Pass isn't just in the mystery of what drove them out of the tent. It's in the hours of agonizing bravery that followed. They were 9 individuals who, in the face of an incomprehensible threat, tried to save one another until the very end. Today, the pass is marked by a modest monument. It bears the names and faces of the 9 hikers, their youthful smiles etched in stone, forever frozen in 1959. Travelers who make the arduous journey to the site often speak of a profound, heavy silence that hangs over the slope. The wind still screams across the face of Kholat Syakh, and the snow still shifts in the night. What happened on that mountain may never be known with absolute certainty. We are left with a mosaic of fragmented evidence: a slashed tent, a radioactive sweater, a blurry photograph, and the broken branches of a cedar tree. Perhaps it was a rare meteorological event, a freak slab of snow, or a secret of the Cold War that has long since been buried in some deeper, darker archive. But as the sun sets over the Urals, casting long blue shadows across the snow, the mystery of the Dyatlov Pass remains as cold and untouchable as the stars above. The mountain keeps its secrets, and the 9 hikers remain as they were in their final diary entries, young, ambitious, and moving forward into the white unknown. What they found in the darkness of that February night remains a silent part of the landscape, a story that begins with a journey of discovery and ends in the profound, echoing silence of the Mountain of the Dead.